Today we're talking about the introvert hangover, also known as the social hangover, feeling socially drained, overstimulated, or getting peopled out. We're going to talk about what the introvert hangover is, if it's even a real thing, what causes it, and how to prevent or recover from it. Maybe you've never heard of the introvert hangover, or maybe you have experienced it before and you want some insights on how to deal with it. Then join me for this chapter of Productive Introvert Community, the podcast. Hi, it's Mariela. In each chapter of this podcast, I'm sharing with you what I'm researching and what I'm learning on my mission to understand what introverted solopreneurs really need to effectively manage their time, their energy, and to focus on the things that are important to them. We'll drill down to the day-to-day and how to create healthy habits that support you as an introverted solopreneur so that you can naturally excel in your business and life. So what is the introvert hangover? The introvert hangover is when introverts feel physically and mentally drained after being in a very stimulating environment, usually one that includes socializing with other people. It's sometimes also referred to as the social hangover, being socially drained, getting overstimulated, or just getting peopled out. You may also come across the term the highly sensitive hangover because highly sensitive people experience something similar when they receive too much stimuli. As a side note, if you're wondering if all highly sensitive people are introverts, the answer is no. Elaine Aron, who came up with the term highly sensitive person, estimates that 70% of highly sensitive people are introverted and the other 30% are extroverted. So how do you know if you're having an introvert hangover? The thing that introverts notice the most is feeling really tired and even unwell. So things like nausea, headaches, foggy brain, having trouble concentrating, and getting bothered by noises and lights. Essentially, it's very similar to a hangover after a night out drinking, but it happens even when there's no alcohol involved. It often happens after an activity with lots of socializing or lots of stimulation, and they feel an intense desire to be alone afterwards. So usually curled up somewhere on a couch with a book, but in extreme cases, completely dark room, noise canceling headset, and a bag over your head. Yeah, I'm only half joking. I came across an article on Introvert Dear, and it describes 12 signs that you might experience during an introvert hangover. They include the things that I just mentioned, but there are also a few others. So I'll link to that resource and every resource that I talk about in this episode in the description. So check those out if you want to know more about any of the things that we're talking about today. The first question that you might be asking: is the introvert hangover even a real thing? The introvert hangover isn't an official term or a scientific term. There isn't really any research done about the topic itself. And if you search for it, for example, on Google, most of what you'll find are anecdotal examples. So people telling about their own experience with introvert hangover. But there are so many examples of this, and introverts all over the world describe very similar reactions to too much socializing. So I think it's definitely worth being aware of what this is and how it might show up in your life and how you can deal with it. I've personally also experienced introvert hangovers. For example, when I've been out all day traveling, usually I travel a few hours if I'm meeting a friend in another city, and then spend a couple of hours with that friend before traveling back home. So during the day, I can feel a little bit tired, but nothing major. And I can thoroughly enjoy spending that time with that person. But then for me, often the next day, I'll suddenly feel really, really ill. Like stomach issues, nausea, headaches, and exhaustion. Very similar to what other people describe. And this has been happening to me for years, even before I heard of the term introvert hangover. Because this kept happening to me, but my friends, they didn't seem to, get ill from a day out. I thought that I was just a bit sickly. And, the idea of being a low energy person, I internalized that idea. And I just assumed that I couldn't handle as much as other people could. Maybe something similar has happened to you and you started to think that something was wrong with you. I hope that this podcast will shed some light on these types of topics and that you can understand that there's nothing wrong with you. It may be as simple as having different needs when it comes to managing your energy than we're usually taught, and that you simply need to understand what your needs are and what healthy habits you can develop to create space for that. Let's dive into the science for a few minutes about biological differences between introverts and extroverts. What does science say about this? So even though the introvert hangover isn't a scientifically used term, there is some interesting data about the difference between an introvert's brain and an extrovert's brain. One of the most interesting differences is how our brains respond to dopamine. What's dopamine? If you've ever heard of the happy hormone, it usually is dopamine that people are referring to. Although calling it the happy hormone is a bit misleading. We won't go into that in detail today, and we can talk about dopamine and why calling it the happy hormone is misleading in another episode. So leave a comment if that is something that you would like to know more about. For now, let's briefly talk about the main role of dopamine and the difference between introverts and extroverts according to scientific studies. When dopamine is released in the brain, simply put, it signals pleasure. So dopamine triggers a quick boost in feeling pleasure, and it activates a reward system to do more of that thing. Biologically, we are wired to do things that give us instant pleasure, instant gratification, and dopamine is at the center of that. Keep in mind that that's not the only thing that dopamine does. It's also involved in things like memory, heart rate, movement, pain, sleep, attention, just to name a few. And it also doesn't function alone. There are other hormones and substances in the brain that essentially teach the brain what's good and what's bad. On a biological level, that is, not necessarily on a moral level. So what does this have to do with introverts and extroverts? One of the differences between introverts and extroverts that studies found is that introverts are more sensitive to dopamine. This means that with a low level of dopamine, an introvert's brain already gets the quick boost, while extroverts need a much higher level of dopamine to get that same pleasure signal. And what causes the release of dopamine are usually stimuli from outside. Think of delicious food, an interesting conversation with someone, touching someone, but also things like the lights flickering on and off, or the background noise in a supermarket can cause the release of substances like dopamine. Because introverts are more sensitive to dopamine, they need less stimulation than extroverts do to already get that release of dopamine. And this could explain why introverts get overstimulated more easily by things that don't really seem to have an effect on extroverts. There are studies that found other differences in the brains of introverts and extroverts, things like blood flow and other hormone signaling. Some of these studies are described in this book, The Introvert Advantage by Marty Olson-Laney. This was the first book that I ever read about introversion years ago, and it was a real eye-opener for me. I am planning on doing an episode of the podcast about this book, so let me know in the comments if you'd like me to do a book review on this book and dive into it with me. Okay, so that was a brief overview of the introvert hangover and differences in how introverts and extroverts respond to dopamine in the brain. Let's now bring this back to your daily life. What can you learn from this? First of all, if you're an introvert and you've experienced sudden crashes in your energy after lots of social interaction, I want you to know that you're not alone. There are people all over the world experiencing very similar things. One thing that bothers a lot of introverts is that introvert hangover can feel very sudden and unpredictable. But there is a predictability to it. There are certain conditions and situations that can trigger an introvert hangover. If you can observe what these situations are and put simple habits in place that can help you move through it, this can completely change your relationship with your own energy needs. And it doesn't have to be something that catches you off guard. Observe yourself during and also after the situation, and pay attention to how your energy levels, your mood, and your behavior changes. Here are a few questions that you can ask yourself. Do you feel energized or drained after interacting with this person or this group of people? What do you feel like doing immediately after or even the next day? And did you feel recharged after a good night's sleep? Especially when introverts are mentally drained, and that's something that happens during the introvert hangover. Sleep doesn't help you to fully recharge. You can get 10 hours of sleep and still feel pretty messed up if you're experiencing an introvert hangover because of that mental drain. So especially if you notice that a good night's sleep doesn't help you to recharge, then that's a sign that you were overstimulated. Observing yourself in that way will help you to create awareness about what type of situations overstimulate you, and by checking what it is that you naturally feel like doing afterwards will give you clues how you can potentially recover. So once you become aware of what situations cause you to become overstimulated or cause an introvert hangover, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to avoid those situations outright. Do realize that that's always a viable option, okay? So I believe that the question, how important is this to me and do I need to keep doing it, is the most important question that you can ask when it comes to energy management and time management. But you don't have to avoid going to social events altogether. You can learn to manage your energy within the situation. So let's spend the last few minutes talking about practical ways to either prevent or recover from introvert hangover. So let's say that you're at an event and you feel that it's becoming a bit too much. What a lot of introverts do is just sit there and slowly withering away, enduring it until they can finally go home. And then they're usually crash and are unavailable for any interaction for the next 2 weeks or so. At least that's what I used to do. Instead, try focusing on micro breaks. So these are maybe 5 or 10 minute breaks that you can take to get a little bit of a breather from all the activity. Ask yourself, what are 5 simple things that I could do to take breaks when things become too much? I'll give you some examples. If there are animals or pets, beautiful. Play with the dog, play with the cat. How about taking short walks outside or stepping out onto the balcony? By the time I'm recording this, it's almost Christmas. So one thing that I sometimes do is slowly admire every single ornament on the Christmas tree. Washing the dishes. I know a lot of introverts who kind of sneak off to the kitchen and do this because people rarely bother you when you're doing dishes, and you can take a break and still do something useful for the host. Another thing that I like to do, mostly when I'm with close friends or family, is I bring a book with me. And I'll pick a seat at the far end of the room and read a few pages whenever I need a little bit of quiet time. Sometimes I even put in earplugs to dampen the noise and the input that's going on around me. The first time I did this, I was really worried that everyone would think that I was weird. And well, some people probably do think that I'm weird for doing that, but after a while, they just accept it. And people are fine with it. Preventing to getting to that really overstimulated stage, taking micro breaks is really helpful. Come up with your own options and your own mix of micro breaks, and you can even turn this into a secret little game that you can have some fun with. There will be times when you still get overstimulated and you end up in the introvert hangover. In that case, it's important to be really gentle and give yourself the space to recoup. Think of it as an injury. If you think of spraining your ankle, you take some time off the ankle, you carefully walk, you put on ice packs. Treat an introvert hangover the same way. Your body and your mind, your brain, needs time to recover. And your answer to the question, what do I feel like doing after I've had a lot of stimulation, gives you some clues to what you might do to recoup that energy. And a lot of introverts, we naturally know what we need at that point, either cuddling with a book or spending more time in nature. Whatever it is that you feel is your ice pack in that moment, give yourself space to do that. And that will be the best way for you to regain your energy and move through the introvert hangover. I hope this podcast episode gave you some insights or inspired you in some way. I want to thank you for spending this time with me. If you're catching this in real time, I want to wish you a Merry Christmas and have a lovely time with your loved ones. Next week is right after Christmas. I'm going to do a short episode to share some of the Christmas traditions that we do in our family. I'll show you our Christmas tree that's in the back there up close, and a tradition that I started a few years ago where we hang really unique and personal tree ornaments in our tree, and it turns decorating the tree and admiring the tree during this time even more meaningful. So if you want to share that with me, please go ahead and tune in next week, and on video you'll be able to see some of the ornaments that I will show you on our tree. Bye for now, and Merry Christmas. See you next week. Thank you for listening to the Productive Introvert Community Podcast. If you're an introverted entrepreneur and you're ready to thrive in your own way, then connect with me on thefrankermessage.com/contact.